Hi, everybody. Welcome to the continuation of the Fall Calgary Conference. And in this session, we want to welcome those of you who are listening in 2115. And we want you to know that we knew you would be here. Nobody else did, but we did. And in this conference, we can explain to you why we knew you were going to be here. There is a very logical reason to this. And we don't know what type of world you live in right now, but we do know that there is a truth of the gospel that absolutely supersedes time and everything that has gone on from my lifetime all the way up to yours and all the way back, and everything that is to come yet. I want to introduce to you someone actually at the time of this recording has already passed away. And Don, our friend Donald Allen Beresford Bartlett, and as he says in his own introduction, and he's saying hello to people, he said, and my parents did other cruel things to me too. We know that Don's voice for us is still very powerful, and we know that those of you that are listening in 2015, that his voice will still be just as powerful for you as it has been for us. We want you to enjoy this session. Don is going to go into the greatest detail that you could possibly have heard, even from now until 2115. We think very seriously that this session contains more accurate information about the New Testament and also about the Hebrew Scriptures that absolutely must be contained. They've got to be understood. And there is no one who does this better than our friend Don Bartlett. You can call him anything you want. You can call me anything you want now. People are calling me things even now. So we do want you to understand, and those of you that are watching this conference live and are live, see, we have a view. The gospel has given us a view of the future and a realization that the future does exist. Christianity and mysticism does not offer that view, and none of them thought that any of you in 2115 were ever going to be here, but we knew you would. We love you. Take a listen now to my friend and the most wonderful encounter that I've had in my life in helping me understand the gospel of grace and the gospel of peace. And now is your next speaker, Donald Allen Beresford Bartlett.
Who knows the saying that only the victors write the history? History is always written by the victors. Orthodoxy with the victors. Orthodoxy simply means this is the accepted way of doing it. Heterodoxy is based from the Greek word meaning the power to choose. So from the very first, Orthodox folks said, these people here choose differently than we do. They're heretics. They believe in heresy. And heresy hunters were around from very early on, 2nd century, actually 1st century, actually in the New Testament we can see them. First thing we need is a framework, and I'm not going to try and prove to you the resurrection if we don't already know that Jesus lived. So we're going to go back a little bit to, was Jesus a real figure? But we're even going to go back further than that. Now, what a framework is something that I base my life on. Every time I get up in the morning, I figure that my feet are going to hit the floor, not the ceiling. Now, if that wasn't true, I'd be living my life a whole lot differently. But that gives me a framework in which to live. So we're also going to have a framework in which to see, was Jesus a real character? Not going to try to prove that he was resurrected unless we already believe he lived. If down the road someone listens to a tape and they say, Beres Bartlett taught this in Calgary on such and such a date, well, the first thing we've got to accept is that I was here. If we're going to argue over what I said, don't go saying when you're losing the argument, oh, but you weren't there anyway. So, before we examine the resurrection of Jesus, first let's establish just who and what he was. Now, tomorrow morning, I'm going to be doing a lot more on the resurrection, and then again in another session, we'll be finishing it off. So, this is something we're spreading over a couple of nights. Let's go even further back to the scriptures, which predicted his birth, his life, and his death. The standard lies of Christianity is something we've got to look at right now, because these standard lies of Christianity have plagued us all at one time or another. Number one is the church has always been united in vision, purpose, and structure. Nothing could be further from the truth. And we find that in the Bible itself. You don't have to look into history. Just read the Bible. 2, there are existing original manuscripts for the Bible, particularly the New Testament. That is the biggest crock of frogs droppings you will ever hear outside a political campaign. 3, there was a very honest approach to deciding what books were to be in the Bible. Oh, really? Then how come Luther didn't want James in there and put Hebrews and Revelations at the back because he didn't think very much of them either? And how come it was a real fight to get James even into the Bible in the first place? Because you know Paul is always talking about that great stuff. We need someone over here who'll act as a foil, and then we can hammer them together and say, see, that's the whole truth. A duck doesn't fly unless it's got both wings. And that's exactly what happened with the book of James when it was put in the Bible. What was it put in the Bible? How was it decided? This is what orthodoxy claims. Number 1, apostolic authority. Really? Who wrote Hebrews? Was that an apostle? B, the rule of faith. Now, the rule of faith was a real common one that is taught in seminary and theological circles, and it simply means this: whatever orthodoxy teaches you is true. If it doesn't agree with what orthodoxy teaches you is true, then it should not be in the Bible. The third one is continuous usage and acceptance by the church at large. Well, there's a problem right there. A fellow called, the book called The Shepherd of Hermes was used extensively in the first century. Hebrews, not so much. James, not until about 300 AD. So all of these rules that you'll hear given to you, why books were put in the Bible, they all sound good on the outside. So, firstly, what are the scriptures? Jesus says, don't think that I've come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy but fulfill. What a self-righteous son of a gun, huh? Whoa! I tell you, we'll look at this later. It doesn't matter if he was perfect. He thought he was perfect. Then in John, Jesus says, search the scriptures. Oh, that must be Hebrews and James and Revelation and Paul's writings and Acts, is it? And the Gospels even. No, they weren't written. Search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life. And they are they which testify of me. And then on the road to Emmaus, Jesus meets the disciples and they're bawling about the bad things that had happened in Jerusalem that week. And Jesus, beginning at Moses, in Luke 24 verse 27 says, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. What are the scriptures? What we have established very clearly in the Gospel Revolution as the scriptures is the law, the Psalms and the prophets. Jesus attested to it. The disciples attested to it. Now, there are 2 basic evidences for scripture: internal evidences and external evidences. Anyone want to go home yet?
No.
Okay. External evidence number 1, canonization. The Old Testament was codified and canonized over a period of 1,500 years by religious scholars, usually trained from birth, to be devoted to the maintenance of a culture dedicated to honouring God. The New Testament was formalised under the authority of one man who devoted his life to being a God. I'm talking of Constantine. In the 2,000 years since the birth of Christ, the Bible, as we now see it, was only canonised 500 years ago. How many people knew that? In 1580 odd. That's the first and only time it's ever been canonised. No Protestant has ever canonised the Bible. Oh, they've taken bits out and put bits in and rewritten it different ways, but they've never canonised it. As I said, that was at the same church council that encouraged you to worship Mary. 400 years after the birth of Christ, Constantine made himself the sole arbiter of what would and what would not constitute the accepted books of the New Testament, by assembling those church elders who could come to an agreement about what deserved to be included, and disposing, by whatever means necessary, all others who disagreed, and for the sole political purpose of unifying his kingdom under the auspices of one religion that had one set of rules clearly laid out in one document. The rituals and beliefs were of secondary importance to the greater political end. Also remember this, that this same pagan pedophile who murdered his own wife and son titled himself Pontifex Maximus. What's every pope's title? Pontifex Maximus. The original meaning in Latin was the great high priest of the pagans, a title which continues to this day. This is the same emperor god who built you'll love this, he built a huge Christian cathedral, it's called a basilica back then, and it was on the same floor plans as a pagan basilica, and he put in there 13 marble tombs, 12 around a circle and one in the middle. The 12 were for the 12 apostles, and the one in the middle was for guess who? Yeah, Pontifex Maximus, who else? Now, in spite of all the Roman Catholic claims that he was converted to Christianity, he was buried, there is historical evidence, he was buried with all the ritual and worship with which all Roman emperors before him were buried, all the pagan emperors. When the New Testament was formalised, all those who disagreed with Constantine and his choice leaders and his church of choice leaders. When I was a kid, I had to do this play, and I only had one line in the whole play, and the only line I had was, "Lo, a herd of horses." And I said, "Lo, a horde of hearses." Oh boy. The way Constantine did it was he killed off the opposite. It's easy to be right and have no opponents when you can kill them, don't you think? External evidence number 1 was canonization. External evidence number 2, transcription. The first thing under transcription that we need to know is this, that there was specialised training in the Old Testament for taking a scroll and copying it to another scroll. Trained from childhood to be specialist scribes. You remember the story of Samuel? His mum said, "God, give me a son, and if you do, I'll put him in the temple." Wonder what he did in the temple. Huh? Ever thought? There was a whole group, a whole tribe, and that's where tithing came from. Tithing came to support the tribe that was running the theocracy. If you wanted a marriage certificate, a death certificate, if you wanted a birth certificate, you go to the temple. And the temple clerks, Levites, would take care of it. If you wanted to get married, the Levites would oversee it. If there was taxation, the Levites would take care of it. So this whole tribe, one of its jobs was to copy scrolls from one to another. Once they had the scrolls, and scrolls weren't around, by the way, probably until between 600 and 1000 BC. They weren't around like in Samuel or in Moses' days, and we're going to have a look at that in a moment. In the New Testament, there were no trained specialists. In the Old Testament, there's trained specialists. In the New Testament, no trained specialists. No one can point to them. The second point is quality control. One jot or tittle, don't you love those words? A jot or a tittle. One jot or tittle out of place, and the scroll was burned. That's a pretty gutsy move in a day when a scroll costs a bunch of money that it did. The scribes would check on each other as well. Now, the second quality control was something called gematria. Like Chinese characters, in written form, Hebrew is a pictographical language. If you want a mouth in Chinese, there's a mouth. In the alphabet, in the Hebrew, in Greek it goes alpha, beta, gamma, delta. In Hebrew it goes aleph, bet, gimel, dalet. Aleph means a bull's head. It's written like a bull's head with a little horn coming out of it. Bet is written like a tent. You can see the tent and the doorway. Gimel is a camel. And that word has come down to us in English. Gimel, camel. Fascinating how much etymology has transferred from Hebrew into English and other languages. Now, gematria is about the numerical weight of each letter. Aleph was 1, Bet was 2, Gimel was 3, and so on. When all the letters of a scroll were added together, they gave a total number, and if the number wasn't correct, the scroll was burned. That was a secondary form of quality control. As for quality control in the New Testament, can anyone tell me who the quality control experts were? The third point in quality control is emotional stability, calm versus anxiety. Old Testament scribes lived in relative calm with all the tools necessary at their disposal. New Testament scribes were sometimes hunted, sometimes persecuted, often doing their work under the cover of darkness. We talked about that at dinner time there, Vic. The comparison is stark. The comparison's very clear. The next thing we look at is the mode of transcription. Transcription was only from one scroll to one scroll, or one source to another source. But what about the first books of Moses? How were they? Who wrote them? How did Moses ever write about his own death? Now, when you hear people bringing that up, what you're hearing is a furphy. You're hearing a red herring. Because verbal histories are arguably as good as and better than written histories. Every native people that I know of has some kind of a flood story. These are verbal histories, not written histories. If you wish to argue that point, I'll gladly do so after you can show me any written history in which you place full faith. Remember what we said? The victors write the history books. Hebrew writing was around from about 1000 BC, but common from 600 BC. Cuneiform writing was available in Abraham's day. So we don't know exactly when scrolls started to be or when written records commenced. In 1948, we had the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered, in which every one was word for word the same as the other and spread over hundreds of years. The only difference being that the book of Esther was not in some of them. God seemed so casually unconcerned with preserving the accuracy of New Testament writings that today we have in over 5,500 manuscript scrolls and codices, no originals. None. We have originals of the Hebrew. I wonder why God didn't give a rip about the New Testament. Remember that before the invention of the printing press, every publication was copied out by hand, and without the quality control mechanisms that the Old Testament scholars used, copying errors were not just possible, but impossible to avoid. We have hundreds of original copies of Old Testament manuscripts, all of which agree with each other, written hundreds of years apart. We have thousands of copies of New Testament manuscripts, none of which match, none of which agree. We have thousands of copies. In fact, all those New Testament manuscripts, there are more differences between them than there are words in the New Testament. Why? Well, because of intentional changes. Sometimes people just didn't like the way it was written. Because of corrections based on older or better manuscripts, which was a valid reason to change them. Sometimes because of harmonisations from different documents. They'd bring different gospels together and say, oh, well, we'll just make this a harmony of them. Sometimes it was ideologically motivated, or intentional changes again. Sometimes it was unintentional changes. The person doing the copying by candle, it was a tallow light. It was maybe an oil lamp. And sometimes his eye just went to the next line and missed out a whole line. Where the translator, they just got tired, skipped a line. External evidence, number 1 was canonization, number 2 was transcription, number 3 is acceptance. Let's talk about different canons. How many different canons? Now, you know what? When I'm saying a canon, I'm saying a formalised, accepted group of books that people call their Bible. That's how I'm using that word now. How many are there? Well, you've got Russian Orthodox Christianity. They've got their own canon. You've got the Eastern Orthodox Christianity. They got another canon. Greek Orthodox Christianity has their own canon. The Assyrian Church has its own canon. The Armenian Christian Church has its own canon. And remember, there's more. Don't stop there. Remember, the Protestantism is the bastard child of Roman Catholicism. We took what they gave us and changed little to nothing. There are other alleged Protestant churches that either predate or evolved separate to the Protestant Reformation. Remember that. The Church of England, for one, that was never a Protestant church. It is now. We call it a Protestant church, but it never came out of the Protestant Reformation, along with Luther and his group. And all those groups like the Amish, Mennonites, German Brethren, Hutterites that come under the general umbrella of Anabaptists, they were around a couple hundred years before the Protestants ever got off their blessed assurance and did whatever they did. They were never Protestants in the historical sense of the term. Most, if not all, of these disparate groups have different canons, different rituals, different Bibles. You surprised?
No.
Good, you shouldn't be. There are more Christians outside of the accepted Roman Catholic and Protestant brands than within them. External evidence about acceptance, now interpretation. King Jimmy. Not a bad translation, I use it for study. And then you got the nearly inspired version, the NIV. And it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. Why? We had fun on one of the broadcasts. John, I'm going to prepare mansions for you. Oh, okay. You go down to about verse 26 and it says, and anyone who does this, I will come in and make my abode with them, and my Father will also. Same Greek word. He gets an abode, we get a mansion. Woo! What kind of translational integrity is there? So I checked out all of the English versions. They all said mansion. And then I went and I looked at the versions that were written after the King James said mansions. Now Luther said apartments, and other versions said homes. But when we translated into Vietnamese, guess what we said? And I did all the translational work. Mansions. Chinese. Mansions. Huh? Because we have taken one error and just replicated it. Total New Testament manuscripts, 5,300 in the Greek. Maybe 5,500 now. In the Latin, 10,000. In others, 9,300. 24,000 copies altogether. Now, this is up to maybe the year 1400. This is before the printing press, before the Gutenberg printing press. Total manuscripts we have compiled prior to 600 AD, 230. How many Bibles are there? One? How many translations are there? What? Why? Because people cannot agree on what they reckon it says. That was all external evidence. Now we have internal evidence, and this we'll wind up on this, I think, tonight. Michael's going to hate this. You want to hear this bit? I wouldn't tell him at all.
He's going to have to listen to his tape.
He is. He's going to have to listen to his own tapes, yeah. He does, actually. Sometimes he'll ring me up and tell me that. There are 4 reasons, actually, I have. Types and antitypes, fulfill prophecy, hidden bits in between. We'll get them one by one. Types. Types are where in the Old Testament you have a type of Jesus. You have something happening and it's a picture of Jesus. This is what the whole Old Testament's about. Jesus said, it all talks about me. So if you're ever lost in the scriptures, if you're ever lost, you open up at Amos and you don't know what it means, you say, good grief, what was this turkey talking about? Look for Jesus on the page. May work. It works a lot better for me than it doesn't work. Adam is a type of the prototype. He was a type. Jesus was the type also of the new creation, the prototype of each creation. Noah talked about a new creation. Moses is a type of the deliverer, bringing the children out of Egypt. David, he was a picture of Jesus the warrior. Solomon, a picture of Jesus the builder. Then you have the antitypes. You have Cain, Abel, Isaac, Ishmael. Northern kingdom, southern kingdom. You've got these types, then you've got the antitypes, and now you have shadows, what's called a shadow in theological terms, shadows and substance. The tabernacle was a shadow of Jesus. Everything in the tabernacle, in fact, everything in the Holy of Holies was a picture of Jesus. Everything in the temple of Solomon was a picture of Jesus. The rock Moses beat on and out came water of life. That was Jesus. All these were a picture, a shadow of Jesus. You go to the tabernacle, and I'll just go real fast here because I don't want to bore anyone witless. You end up having an Ark of the Covenant. It's covered, it's timber. On the outside, it's beautiful timber, hardwood timber, so it's lasting. everlasting. Then it's covered in gold. It speaks of his purity. Then over that is badger skins, which says that it's not going to look very pretty. Isaiah says in Isaiah, very early in the chapter, he says, who would want to look at him? He's so ordinary. Isaiah 53. Inside it is the Ten Commandments, the 2 tablets. And then there's the rod, Aaron's rod that budded, talking about life. The commandments that talked about death. The whole thing is a picture of Jesus. We can go through the whole Old Testament and get shadows of the substance that was to follow. Internal evidence number 2, fulfilled prophecy. Now, we're not going to prove anything here because that'd take longer than we got. But these prophecies in the Old Testament, we know that they dated from at least 250 years before Christ, because that's when the caves of Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's when these things were discovered. They were sealed up 250 years before the birth of Christ. It wouldn't have mattered if it was one day before. If you could give me the winner of tomorrow's race, I'd take that as a great prophecy. Huh? This is 250 years before, at least. The prophecy said the Messiah will be born in Jerusalem. The Messiah will be born of a virgin. The Messiah will be rejected by his own people. The Messiah will be betrayed by one of his own followers. The Messiah will be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. The Messiah is going to die of crucifixion with pierced hands and feet. The Messiah will be buried in a rich man's grave. The Messiah will be raised from the dead. All of these things were written 250 years before Jesus died. Now, I've heard all the arguments. Believe me, I've heard some frogs droppings. But they don't hold water. The last one, where is that man, Vic? Where is that man? No, that man, Michael, he must really be in a bad way. He's left me to take up the offering. You poor people. Every Hebrew proper name, had a meaning. Jesus. Saviour. You will call his name Jesus because he shall save his people from their sins. Emmanuel, God with us. It didn't matter who it was. They all had a name and they all meant something in Hebrew. Now this is worth coming for tonight. And if you think this is good, you ain't heard nothing yet, because I've got tomorrow morning to go. Bigger offerings. The word Adam in Hebrew means man. He had a son called Seth. Seth, the word in Hebrew means to be appointed or appointed. Enosh, his son, means mortal or will die. Kenan, his son, means sorrow. Mahalalel, his son, means the blessed God. Jared, his son, means shall come down. Will drop. Enoch means teaching. Enoch was the one who was a friend of God. One day he just didn't come home for soup. Methuselah means his death will bring, or his death will tell. Lamech means despairing. And Noah means comfort and rest. Have we all got that? Okay. Okay, now let's talk about something entirely different. Put the meanings of those first generations between Adam and Noah into one sentence, and here's what it reads. Man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down teaching that his death shall bring the despairing ones comfort and rest. Let me read you that again. Man is appointed to mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down teaching that his death shall bring the despairing comfort and rest. Was that worth coming for? I can read you all the way through from there to Jesus.
Can you see the names in there?
I haven't kept all the names, but I can. This is freely available on the internet, by the way. You can just go straight on the web and find it. On YouTube, go into the, how did I get it last time? I'll let you know. Just email me, I'll let you know. I'll put it out on the Powercast, that's what I'll do. We have a Powercast every week. It's a podcast, and the coughing one and I, just call each other names and laugh a lot. And some people say they learn a lot from it. They must be really ignorant, eh? They learn from us. Anyway, the fame of the stronghold of Babylon and sorrow extend their borders like a plant beyond the place of division. Division, the Tower of Babel. But I will make Babylon fade away. I can go through this whole thing, but I'll just end with the one just before Jesus. I have asked God about the ransomed of the Lord, those exiled in Babylon. My Father is awesome. God will raise up a helper. A helper? A helper? God will raise up a helper. The just one will the Lord raise up. God is the one who helps. May the gift of Jacob increase in greatness, for God is with us. God is with us. What name is that? Emmanuel. We can take you from Adam to Emmanuel, Jesus the Christ. And every name of every male son going down that line tells the story of the gospel. Wow.
I wondered why that list was so important.
Yeah, really. There was a lot of begetting done there, I'll tell you that. Well, no wonder Israel was called the picture people, the oracular people of God who would show out his glory. Compare this against the New Testament record, where there was dissension from the outlet. Followers calling themselves after various teachers. I'm of Apollo, I'm of Paul, I'm of Christ. Leaders standing up against each other in public. Paul calling out Peter in Galatians. Whole groups sparring with each other for supremacy. This started in the New Testament. It didn't start 100 years later, guys. In Corinthians, Paul says, for it's been declared to me that some of you, by them which are of the house of Chloe, that there are contentions amongst you. Now this I say, that every one of you who says, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, and I of Cephas, and I of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptised in the name of Paul? There is evidence in the Bible of this happening. We're not making this stuff up. Dissension from the outset. Old Testament, singularity. New Testament, dissension. Where teachers and leaders started dividing and opposing each other. Paul even called Hymenaeus hyena, and Philetus, he called them a cancer. That's pretty heavy words. The Ebionites under James, which was a religion that started under James, Paul withstands Peter to the face in Galatians. Now here's a picture I want you to get. We all talk, wouldn't it be nice to have the New Testament church? Do you remember when you were back in church? Wouldn't it be lovely to have a New Testament church? All of us lovey-dovey and all together and doing this thing. They had it. But when Peter, who loved the taste of salami, when Peter, who didn't mind a bit of barbecued ribs, when Peter gets to Antioch, Paul has to, and he gets in there dancing and doing the old 1-2 with the folk dancing Greeks or whatever they were doing. He loved it. He thought it was and he should have loved it too, because he was the apostle that should have gone to the Gentiles. He was the apostle that Jesus let down the sheet to and said, don't call unclean what I've called clean. He was that apostle. He was the one that was supposed to go to the Gentiles. Why did God have to raise up Paul? And train him God had to raise up Paul and train him by himself in the desert. He couldn't afford to send him off to the church, and that was what Paul taught others. He said, get good teachers to teach good teachers to teach good people. That was his thing. But God didn't do it with him. Why? Because they'd already started messing up back then. They were having blood sacrifices, Acts chapter 17, up to a quarter of a century after Jesus. They still needed blood of a goat, lambs actually. You read about it where Paul goes back and they say, listen, there's a few Nazarites here fulfilling their vows. Would you buy them? Go ahead and even buy the sacrifices for them. Oh yeah, 25 years after the death of Jesus. I'm getting lost now, I should shut up. So here they are in Galatians, in chapter 1, chapter 2. He says, whoever they are, I don't care. They look like pillars, I don't give a rip. He says, because when Peter was there, I withstood him to the face. Because when people came down from James and John, when people came down to see us, he scarpered off from eating salami with the Gentiles and went over here to the Jews' table and said, hello, hi, here I am. Yes, I've been taking care of this bunch, that one and that one and that one. They all eat salami. And that one over there dances really badly. Why was this big, by the way? It was big because every time they got together, they had a meal. And at the end of the meal, the agape feast, they used to call it, they would have the remembrance of Christ. They'd remember Jesus. They'd just pick up a piece of bread and wine and say, here's to you, Jesus. That was it, communion. For the first time in history, we had two Lord's tables. For the first time in history, we had a Lord's table there for the Jews and one over here for the Gentiles. For the first time in history, we had schism coming into the body of Christ. For the first time in history, we had people saying, I am of that group and I am of the reformed group. That's why it's important for us to remember this stuff. It's important for us to remember this stuff didn't start with the Reformation. This started in the Bible. This dissension. How does that compare with the Old Testament? Singularity on one side, total, it's just anyone, whoever wins the fight, which is exactly what happened. The Ebionites, and then you had later the Nazarenes, you had the Nicolaitans. In Revelation it talks about them and says they're bad people indeed. And the Gnostics and the Marcionites came a bit later. You really, Mike taught on this in the Powercast back last September, called The 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And it was gold. It was gold. You've got to listen to it, family. There's only one conclusion I can draw from all of these facts. And I have told you facts tonight. None of what I've told you is guesswork. And that is while the scriptures, some people call it the law of the Psalm and the prophets, it's vindicated and proven out thoroughly. The New Testament is quite another matter. This was covered in even more detail. We did another podcast called The Doctrine of Scripture, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, Part 4. So, tomorrow morning I am going to be showing why, when you say that Jesus was a good and wise teacher, why it's nothing but crap. It is intellectual crap. And then in the next session I'm going to be giving the 4 reasons why the disciples were telling the truth, the 8 different hypotheses of what could have happened, all of the ones that have ever been thought of since the year dot, the facts, the 6 or 7 facts that we have to accept in the New Testament testimony of Jesus, and then I'm going to tell you why I believe that there can only be one answer. Can only be one answer. Now, most of the people, if Jesus Christ, Paul said, if Jesus came out of the grave, great. And if he didn't, we're idiots. And yet most idiots I know have never spent 5 hours in their whole life examining the facts behind the possibility of what could be the greatest thing that has ever happened in this poor old world. And this is why in the gospel, what we are teaching is we are teaching these fundamentals now. We'll be teaching them all weekend. I hope you can join us. Please tell me you're going to be here. I know some people have jobs and all of that, but gosh, it is so lovely and encouraging to see your faces here tonight. I hope I haven't bored you too much with a herd of horses and all of that. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your interest. And as long as we have breath in the gospel revolution, people like Vic up there, people like Mike and Jeff, people like myself, as long as we have breath, we are going to be preaching this gospel. The gospel, see, there's no sense in me saying that God in you and God in me, we're one. Unless I can prove, unless I can rest with absolute assurance on the fact that that man did come out of the grave and he did make a new creation and he did take us into his body. He did hide us in the cleft of the rock as the fire of God went over him, as the anger of God went over him, as all of that stuff in Revelation hit down on Jesus the Christ. We were hidden in the rock. And we, new creation, live to tell this story. Listen, Mr. Person with a AK-47 who wants to, or a knife that wants to cut people's heads off. Listen, you are perfect, holy and righteous in the eyes of God. I want to leave you with a challenge tonight. What would change in your life if you totally believed that you were perfect in every sense? What would change?
Hello again. Michael Williams has a limited vision for the message of the gospel. Not. He wants to touch all of humanity. There's a powerful scripture coming out of the book of Isaiah in chapter 2 and verse 4. And Michael quotes it a lot. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and they shall learn war no more. Is that just a dream? The gospel teaches that you and God are one. The brother or sister you are at odds with has the same Spirit of Christ dwelling in them. That indwelling happened at birth. You don't earn it. It is your birthright. When that knowledge is preached around the world, it is true. They shall learn war no more. We had a setback last year in our finances, and that forced Daniel to go back to his old job, when in fact, he wants to spend full time working on your behalf, on our behalf, to spread this gospel message. So we ask again to open your wallets and support this ministry. For our Canadian friends, go to our website, graceconferences.ca, and hit the donation tab. For our American friends, go to Gospel Revolution and hit the donate tab. Thank you very much for what you're able to contribute.